The Lost Year, Chapter 6, Old Friends. The rain made things a bit more difficult, but between the two of them, Balinor and Merlin made it over the border and into the small town of Engad. It was a touch larger than Ealdor, actually having an inn that also served as a tavern. Merlin had stayed here once before, when searching for Balinor for the first time. It hadn't changed much, but the clientele seemed to have shifted. More townsfolk and less people Merlin suspected would slit her throat in her sleep. She took care of the horses while her father sought out a room for the night. Merlin entered the inn and resisted the urge to shake water out of her hair. It was getting quite long, and honestly she should cut it soon. She spotted her father at one of the tables, 2 tankards already in front of him. She slid around the room, not noticing one of the hooded figures at the bar looking over at her and tracking her movements to the table. She sat down, and her father pushed the tankard towards her. She took it and took a draw on it. The alcohol burned, but the warmth was welcome. Merlin tensed slightly as someone stepped up to their table. "And what might you two strangers be doing here?" the man asked, the mace in his hand clattering to the table. He was stocky, with short-cropped brown hair and beady eyes.
"Just passing through,"
Balinor said, and the man frowned, but one of the hooded figures from the bar stepped forward and laid a hand on the man's shoulder.
"Haldor, it's all right. I know her,"
the figure said, pulling down his hood with a familiar grin. Merlin shot to her feet, practically skipping forward to pull Lancelot into an embrace.
"It's good to see you, Merlin,"
he said, returning the embrace. "Oh, this is Merlin! Well then, be welcome, friends," the man, Haldor, said, tucking his mace into his belt. "Apologies, but one can never be too careful these days. Lancelot has told us a few stories about your bravery, my girl. We'd be honored to have you as a guest here in Engad," Haldor said, offering his arm to Merlin, who shook his hand. "You've told them stories about me?" Merlin asked, her eyebrow communicating her real question.
"Only the good ones,"
Lancelot said, taking the seat next to her. She grinned. "Well, Lancelot, I would like to introduce you to my father," Merlin said, gesturing to a bemused-looking Balinor, who smiled, offering his arm to the ex-knight. Lancelot took it and shook it.
"Your daughter is truly one of the bravest souls I have ever met,"
Lancelot said with a serious tone that made Merlin blush bright red and hide her face in her tankard of mead. Balinor smiled.
"I know. She told me your story. You are the best kind of friend I can imagine her having, Sir Lancelot. My name is Balinor."
The title was delivered without a trace of irony. Lancelot smiled.
"What brings you down this way?"
he asked Merlin.
"Thought you'd be in Camelot. Rumor has it there was a bit of a mess a while back with a dragon,"
Lancelot said lightly, but his eyebrow climbed. Not an accusation, but curiosity. Merlin and Balinor exchanged a look, a mix of pain and laughter on their faces. "My mother fell ill near a month ago. She passed, but my father and I have been traveling for a few reasons. I plan to return to Camelot tomorrow," Merlin said as the barmaid came over carrying 3 plates of steaming food, followed by Haldor, who was carrying his own plate. He sat down next to Balinor. "Now, any friend of Lancelot's is welcome here," the man boomed, and Merlin grinned. Haldor leaned forward. "Has he gotten around to telling you what it is we do here?" Haldor asked. Merlin shook her head.
"Well, it's a bit complicated,"
Lancelot said, picking up a hunk of fresh bread off his plate. Haldor let out a bark of laughter. "Hardly complicated. Senred could give a toss about the people he sees as beneath him. We take care of him instead," Haldor said, and Merlin's grin widened. "That sounds like a wonderful calling," she said, raising her tankard. Haldor knocked his against hers and laughed. "You're right, Lancelot, I do like her. We could use a physician in our ranks," he offered, and Merlin shook her head. "I can't. I'm not fully trained, and my life is in Camelot," she said, frowning. Haldor nodded. Balinor spoke up.
"I have some knowledge of the healing arts. I have nowhere to go with any urgency. Perhaps I can be of some assistance,"
he offered, and Haldor clapped him on the shoulder. "All help is welcome, and you will be welcomed with open arms always, young Merlin." He boomed again, and Lancelot grinned as Merlin went pink and busied herself with her food. The next morning, Merlin mounted Dancer, still without saddle or tack, and Lancelot handed her up her pack.
"Can you take this to Gwen?"
he asked, holding out a letter. Merlin nodded, grinning slightly.
If you ever have need of me, send a letter here. Haldor keeps a base camp just outside of Engad. He'll see to it gets to me.
Lancelot said, and Merlin nodded. Her father squeezed her hand, and she set out back to her home.
A rock slide,
Uther said.
Yes, father. I believe that was what the man assumed was smoke, was just a dust cloud from the rock slides. Several of the passes through the mountain were blocked entirely. There was no sign of this fortress of legends,
Arthur said, and Leon nodding as well. Uther let out a breath and nodded.
Very good.
He waved a hand, dismissing Arthur. He and Leon left the audience hall and headed towards Arthur's chamber so he could change for training. Leon happened to glance out a window. He paused.
Sire,
he called, and Arthur turned, frowning as he stepped up to the window. The view was of the stables and outer yard, and out the window Leon had spotted a familiar figure with raven hair riding up to the stables. By the time Arthur got there, she was dismounting, pulling a pack over her shoulder and handing the lead rope over to one of the stable hands. Arthur let out a breath, and Leon noticed his shoulders ease a bit, as though the tension was bleeding out of him at the sight of Merlin.
You have 10 minutes before you need to be on the training field,
Leon reminded him as Merlin, below, began to head into the castle. Arthur tore his eyes away from the window, glanced at Leon with a calculating look, and forced a sigh out of the first night.
I can stall them and get you maybe 20.
Go. Arthur took off with a grateful nod. He headed straight for Gaius's chambers, and when he got there, he paused, knocking. The door, not fully shut, swung open, and the sight inside made Arthur's throat close. Merlin was hugging Gaius, and both of them were crying. Arthur felt like he was intruding, even more so when Merlin caught sight of him over Gaius's shoulder and released him. She scrubbed at her face and tried for a smile. It just made her shoulders shake again. Arthur was in the room, drawing her into an embrace before he really knew what he was doing.
I'm so sorry, Merlin,
he muttered into her hair. Her sobs only increased in volume.